Hello. Hello. Hi. Welcome to this Morishima lecture. I'm very happy to welcome Chris Udry, our Morishima speaker. I've been told to two things by contract. I have to say something nice about sticker, which I'm very happy to do because because like I was director of sticker for 10 years and I could never express how much I loved it because it was like complimenting myself. But now I can compliment the people that really run stickers. So to Camille and to Lubala, the true spirit of sticker, this is a fantastic research center. It was founded by Micho Morishima back in the 70s with a brilliant idea. Santori and Toyota, drink and drive. He put one against the other. He went to one and said, the one giving me $1 million, the other one, okay, I'll give you $2 million. And then the other one is giving me $3 million, I'll give you $5 million. And so we ended up with a beautiful endowment that we can use to do anything we want, which is really a visionary idea because most research outfits are funded by people that think they know what the research should be about, which is kind of curious because the economists or any researcher, they don't know what they're going to research, right? It's all a process of discovery. So endowing a center to research A, B, and C makes no sense. Nietzsche understood that. So the second thing that I'm by contract obliged to talk about is creative destruction. so Micho was a creative destructor. Okay? He changed the way research was funded and he created this wonderful place as a consequence. And our speaker today is a very famous creative destructor because at the time when people like him were doing high theory or at most using data from the United States, Chris decided that there were parts of the world more interesting to study and set off to Nigeria, I think, for the first time, and produced his nonmarket paper on insurance, informal insurance in Nigeria, which, if you read it today, is one of the few papers that stand the test of time. Okay, it's still as relevant and as up to date as it was back in 1990 something. The 1990 something, and Chris didn't know this, is when I started graduate school. And I wanted desperately to do development, but development at the time was considered to be not a serious subject. It was a qualitative field work, you go get lost in Nigeria and Ghana, wherever, you come back with a description of things that nobody in America cares about. And so I was going around with Chris's paper showing that no, you can collect actual data and estimate real models. And so that was the credibility revolution for me, your paper, Chris. I'm not sure whether they believe me, but I got away with it and I did development and the rest follows. So I'm very happy to have Chris here. And he's going to talk about agricultural productivity organization and transformation in Africa. Please.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for introducing me. Thank you for putting this together. Yeah, so I want to talk to you about agricultural productivity, social organization, and rural transformation, economic transformation, and well, really mostly West Africa. This was working a minute ago. This one. Okay. The world's getting better in some very important ways. If we look at the past 60 years of poverty, it's declined remarkably. The share of the world's population that's poor is just going towards zero. This is great news. This is about the best news I could imagine, starting off with. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of people who are still really poor. And so what we see in West Africa, for most of that 60 years where we saw that decline in the share of poor, there's still growing numbers of people stuck in rural West Africa that are very poor. Now we do see the declines, especially in Ghana, and there's some GDP rebasing that makes it look like things got a lot better all of a sudden in Nigeria. But there's some, at least the numbers of poor seems to be leveling out, maybe even declining in some places. Much of this is due to people leaving rural areas. This is the share of the population in rural areas. In West Africa as a whole, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and in Mali, which are the places I'll be talking about. The rural poverty rate of those people who are still in rural areas has been stubbornly high until, again, the last few years, with the exception of Ghana, which has been doing better. So the globe is making great progress on limiting extreme poverty. That progress is less obvious in parts of West Africa, and there's still a lot of people who are in rural areas who are very poor. In fact, the majority of the very poor in West Africa are in rural areas. The most immediate cause of that poverty is low agricultural productivity. Everybody who's in a rural area in Africa, in West Africa in particular, is tied to agriculture. They're either farming themselves or they're doing something immediately adjacent to farming. And so the most important immediate cause of poverty is that your farm isn't producing enough food or enough output for you to sell. This is, we've got better data on Ghana than most places. So this is the last few years, late teens, patterns of maize yields in Ghana. This is the official data from the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. This is data from a sample of farmers that I've been working with for quite a while, and that we'll use in some of the work that I'll be showing you. The yield that Ghana claims is significantly higher than the yield in our sample, but our sample's from the poorest part of Ghana, so both those numbers might be right. But both those numbers are dwarfed by what the Food and Agriculture Organization says yields could be in. This tenfold increase in yields between what people are actually getting and what agricultural scientists think people could get is called the yield gap. And it's enormous. And if you go to ministries of agriculture or ministries of finance around Africa, there will be persistent questions about the yield gap in agriculture. Now, that's something that as economists, we should say we don't care about. We don't care about yields of crops. We care about profits to farmers, but they're going to be closely related. Here's the actual potential yields in Ghana, Mali, Nigeria. In all cases, it's a factor of 5 to 10-fold differences in yields that farmers actually get versus what agronomists say they should be able to get. So potential yields is it begs the question, but it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from crop models using detailed data on soil and topography and rainfall, and it may be the case that it's possible to achieve those yields on farms. It's unlikely that would be the profit maximizing thing to do, but the gap is large enough that it looks like there's some potential for improving productivity. And so that's the first gap that we'd be worried about. What's the difference between what you could get out of your farm and what you are getting out of your farm? I'll continue to call that the yield gap. Although if we had the proper data, we would graph the profits being achieved on people's farms versus the potential profits they could get. But I'll call it the yield gap anyway. There's another gap. If we look at this is the United States. This is actual yields of maize farmers. As you can see, actual yields of maize farmers in the United States are higher than the potential yields in West Africa. And the potential yields in the United States of America are double the potential yields in West Africa. So there's two gaps for us to worry about. One is the yield gap, which is the gap between what farmers are getting in West Africa and what they could get given current technology. And then there's the technology gap. The gap between what agronomists say you could get in West Africa and what you can get in the United States. So what is standing in the way of increased potential yields in West Africa? Well, agricultural technology has got a high degree of circumstantial sensitivity. That's a phrase that Bob Evanson brought into the literature. Agricultural technologies are more or less effective depending upon the circumstances in which you're applying them. There's the efficient use of seed and its surrounding suite of activities, the agronomy of it, depends very strongly on the environment in which it's embedded. That's obvious for rain-fed agriculture. If it's raining, you're going to get different yields than if it's not raining. So the technology, the performance of the technology is going to depend upon the weather, the rain, the soil, on factor prices, on product prices, on credit markets, and on product market prices. And when there are non-tradable, when there are frictions in any of these markets, agricultural productivity, the productivity of any given technology is going to depend upon a whole suite of social institutions that surround its use. And so the technologies that are developed in one part of the world won't necessarily be profitable in another part of the world, given the different circumstances in which the agriculture takes place, both physical and economic and social. A brilliant recent example of this is this great paper by Moscana and Sastry, who document the importance of the varying disease environments that different farmers face. And so if you're a farmer in Western Europe, your ecology is different from a farmer in the United States, but not as different as it is for a farmer in Nigeria. So the pests, the diseases that are threatening your crop yields are very different in West Africa than they are in other parts of the world. And so the extent to which you can adopt a technology developed in another place depends on how similar that place is to you. Actually, let me say, I was going to say this. Let's ask questions throughout. I think we're a small enough group that we can actually have a dialogue. So please feel free to ask questions whenever. And
sorry, apologies. I was supposed to say that. Do we have data on the dispersion of yields? That is there examples of people who reach the potential yield in West Africa? Because if you look at farms, there is a long tail of productive farms that are as productive as the US.
Yes, yeah, and you can find examples. There's experimental stations.
So it's truly possible.
So it's possible to do 3 times as well as what farmers are doing. I've not seen anybody achieve the potential yields.
And not even in the US achieve the potential yields.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I bet you can. Because that's where the crop models are designed.
All right, so it's the benchmark.
So I think you can. So Nigeria, Ghana, Mali have invested in agricultural technology for their own use. And in fact, this is the global mean of agricultural research spending per agricultural employee, per farmer. So across the globe, it doesn't look like West Africa is doing all that bad. Nigeria, in fact, has had a big boom in public agricultural research. And Ghana has basically sort of kept pace with global spending. Mali, not so much. There's private sector investment in research and development in agriculture, which doesn't exist in West Africa. But there's some public research in West Africa on agricultural technologies that may be more suited for the circumstances in West Africa. But it looks really small compared to the investment in a successful developing country agricultural research program. Brazil's Embrapa has had a stunning record of success in generating new technologies to boost agricultural productivity in Brazil. And as soon as you try to graph that with West Africa, it's really puts into perspective what's going on in West Africa. And if you look at the United States, even Brazil looks like nothing is happening. Okay, so there's orders of magnitude larger expenditure in the public sector in the United States on new agricultural technologies than there is in anywhere else outside the developed world. And the private sector, the dashed line, is now in fact superseding the public sector investment in agricultural technology. And this pattern goes back 30 years here, go back a couple hundred years, and this pattern continues. So there's an accumulated stock of technological improvement that has taken place in agriculture in the United States and other temperate locations compared to this very small investments in research in West Africa in particular. And developing a new technology is arguably more difficult in Africa and West Africa than in most parts of the world. And this is due to the extreme heterogeneity of the circumstances in which agriculture is produced in West Africa. There's enormous heterogeneity in the physical environment across West Africa. There's extreme variation in weather patterns and rainfall patterns, and there's a set of market failures that mean that factor prices and output prices vary widely across space. And so as a consequence, there's much more variability in yield in West Africa than in, say, the United States. So this is a cumulative distribution function of yields across plots in Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, and Niger. And the and the purple line is the distribution of yields across maize farms in the United States. Okay. So what you notice is that the purple line is essentially a straight line up. Everybody gets the same yield. The ratio of the 95th percentile of yields to the 5th percentile of yields in the United States is about 200%. So and in fact, in the book that I read that number, the author was lamenting the extreme dispersion of yields across farms in the United States. And this guy's farm is getting 200% more yield than this guy's farm. What's wrong? We should be able to equalize those. The corresponding numbers for Uganda, the 95th percentile ratio to the 5th percentile. For Uganda, it's 2,300%. For Nigeria, it's 9,900%. Niger, it's 6,000%. So it's just vastly more variable than it is in the United States. What that means is that any particular technology that you develop is likely to be suitable for a smaller number of farmers given the underlying heterogeneity. Yes.
There's conflict going on in Africa, but not in the US.
Yes.
So maybe those 5% farms at the bottom, they suffer from violence, not the wrong technology.
Absolutely. It might be that. We actually, and in a paper that I'm not going to be talking about, we look at that, and it's certainly true that yields collapse when violence is nearby. So that could be part of the story. Absolutely. Another part of the story is risk, pure weather risk, and we'll be talking about that too. But a big part of the story, it turns out, is dirt varying in its quality and infrastructure being very different in different places. Yes.
How is the data collected? Are these self-reported, or their crop cuttings, or their?
I love this question. These are self-reported data, and so there's reason to believe that those are incorrect. There's a lot of measurement error in that, and these are yields, and so it's output divided by land area, also self-reported, also measured with error, and so that's going to be part of what's driving us as measurement error.
Also, maybe in the US, people know what they're supposed to produce, and so they all give you the same number.
That is possible too.
That's why there is less
That is
dispersion.
possible too. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Chris was wondering, in other developing countries in Asia, the Green Revolution did happen.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore, there might be the Africa-US comparison might be limiting us in terms of the range of possibilities. And there too, there's soil heterogeneity, institutional variation.
Yeah. I'm going to come to that in a little bit. I would actually argue that the fundamental heterogeneity in Africa is more extreme given its low population density. And this low population density has a lot to do with the history of African, the various slave trades. Yes.
So I have a question related to the yield, but also to the spending, because I think the structure of farming in Brazil and US and in the West Africa is really different, because West Africa is mostly smallholder farmer, like 2 hectares to 5 hectares.
Yeah.
So maybe it plays a role in the yield, and also it plays a role in the spending if you take it per capita. I mean, we just wanted to know that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I'm going that way right now.
Okay.
Okay. There's somebody. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just worried that I won't understand the rest of the lecture if I don't ask them. How are potential yields calculated? How are they determined?
Okay, so they're determined by a model that is generally academically based. For maize, definitely academically based, where basically linear programming models that talk about limiting constraints on productivity. So how much nitrogen there is, how much organic carbon there is, what the rainfall pattern is like, what the temperature pattern is like, what the sunlight is like, and then different seeds have different parameters, and then they use the best seed that they have available for a given area to estimate the potential yield. One anecdote that reflects this long history of agricultural research in developed countries and the much smaller investment in West Africa is that the best seed that we could identify for use in the sample of farmers that I mentioned in Ghana was from South Africa. Whereas if you're in Illinois in the United States, the best seed for a given farmer will be different from a farmer 100 miles away. So the fine tuning of growing material to local conditions is virtually absent. All right. So we've talked about that. Okay. So there's a long line of scholars from Montesquieu up to Jeffrey Sachs that talk about the geographic determinants of poverty and how, well, depending upon the author, various different mechanisms that link fundamentals like the geography of your location to poverty. So my favorite of that group would be Esther Boserup, who's got a couple of brilliant books that set forth basically a geographical determinants story about poverty. She argued that in low population density, high transport cost environment that exists in most of Africa, agriculture will be characterized by long fallow periods to maintain soil fertility. That if this moral hazard, she doesn't actually call it that, but this moral hazard will lead to, given abundant land, people will be farming their own plots. And so that has implications for land rights systems. You don't need to, you've got these long fallows, so you let the land go fallow for a while, and then when you want to farm again, you clear the land and farm your land. You don't need secure property rights over the land. There's implications for the gender division of labor. It fits, it has effects on family structure. And then she argues that as population density increases, fertility management will involve reducing fallows. The value of organic matter in the soil becomes more important. Integration of crops and livestock production begins. The plow you get shorter and shorter fallow periods and becomes optimal to use a plow. Male labor becomes more important relative to female labor. It becomes more important to have secure property rights because you're investing in your land. You get wealth accumulation in land and animals, less independent female farming. These were all part of her geographic determinants of patterns of growth. And what we're not observing in Africa is this intensification that Boserup so persuasively argued would be happening. In fact, if anything, we're observing yields falling. That we're looking at the maybe the opposite of intensification. So this is data from the World Bank Living Standards Measurement Surveys, integrated surveys on agriculture, which is an amazing resource that every developing economist should know about. It's high quality, higher quality than most data sets at the plot level for, well, we put together 200,000 plot seasons worth of data from Ethiopia, Malawi, Mali, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Burkina Faso, and there's more. It's all comparable and it follows people over time. So we've got panels of plot level data with very detailed input-output information that can be linked to weather and to all sorts of external data. And so it gives us a nice picture of what's happening across a wide swath of African countries in terms of yields, labor inputs, other intermediate inputs, farm sizes, technology adoption, and total factor productivity, if you want to believe total factor productivity measures. And what we're seeing across these countries over this decade is a decline in yields, a decline in the use of labor on the land, a decline in the use of most intermediate inputs, an increase in farm size, some adoption of technology, a little bit more irrigation, a little bit more mechanical use, and TFP falling. So that doesn't look like intensification. Yes.
Do we know in these data whether the farms are in any way contiguous, or are they just still another scattered plot?
So the plot sizes are not moving. What's moving is the number of plots per farm. And so this sort of surprising anti-Bosrupian finding was puzzling to us. And what was especially puzzling was that this is most observed in communities that have active labor markets. So in the countries that I'll be talking about mostly, Mali, Nigeria, Ghana, something like 0 to 10% of farm labor is hired. There's a little bit more dispersion in Nigeria and a few other places. But if we look at those villages in which a higher share of the labor is hired, there's more active labor market, that's where we're seeing yields decline. And that's geographic as well. The geographic pictures is the best. Here's the urbanization in Nigeria. And what we see, this is from 2010 to 2020. And what we see is in some parts of Nigeria, up around Kano, around Sokoto, a few other places, Plateau State, we see lots of growth of peri-urban areas. And it's in exactly those states where this is happening that yields are falling fastest in Nigeria.
These people that don't have land, they sell labor, or they have their own land and they sell labor in a.
Right. So
Exactly.
as I'll come to in a second, there's no landless.
Exactly, yeah,
Right.
that's why.
So these are, so what's going on? What's going on is that West Africa is largely open. The non-farm opportunities are increasing in areas that are urbanizing. Productivity of non-farm activities rising means that the opportunity cost of using labor on your farm is increasing. And so by standard Stolper-Samuelson argument, the factor intensities are going to change in agriculture. Wages are going up relative to the cost of land. People are using more land, less labor, increasing labor productivity, lowering yields. And it's an extraction of labor from agriculture, and in response, decreasing yields. So it's a very simple story, but it's a story of structural transformation without agricultural development. It's a stagnant agriculture giving up its labor. Yes.
Is the reason why this is perhaps different to having the development seen with the past, partly due to the fact that trade and agriculture is now more?
Exactly. It's exactly what we think it is. Bosrup's argument was based on a demand side channel, that as commercialization occurs in the cities, as the non-agricultural sector grows, they're going to demand more food. Who's going to produce it? Farmers nearby. Therefore, the land nearby is going to become more valuable. She didn't have a notion of wages rising in this non-farm activity. And so you get exactly what she would say, that there's intensification, that there's more labor being used per unit of land. The openness of Africa to food trade in particular breaks that tie and leads to this pattern of agricultural stagnation, but reductions in poverty. It's just too slow. Yeah. So these two gaps are remaining, right? But both of them, the technology gap is this historically determined mass difference in the viabilities of technologies for Africa versus other parts of the world, and the yield gap is stubbornly sticking with us. Why is that? Okay, now there's no clock in this room, and I could go on
35
for like hours. Okay, so
So you have about 20, 25.
just let me know. It doesn't matter if we don't finish. It's the process that's more important. So feel free to ask questions.
Oh, we have an hour with questions.
Okay. All right. So the the stagnation of agriculture in West Africa has been studied for a lot. There's a variety of frictions that we think underlie the low yields that we still see persisting and actually falling in West Africa. We're going to talk about capital markets, talk about risk and insurance markets, talk about labor markets, we talk about information, new technologies, we talk about transportation costs and infrastructure. We can talk about input markets and output markets. We keep going. There's a lot we could talk about. So I don't propose to actually do that. My argument is going to be that these frictions that exist in different ways in different places induce social entrepreneurs to utilize social institutions to circumvent some of the, to take advantage of the arbitrage opportunities provided by those institutions in a context of market failures. And since those market failures are different in different places, and the social institutions are different in different places, this leads to a continuing spread of the heterogeneity that I think underlies a lot of the low productivity and the difficulty of adopting new technology in Africa. Okay, so I think that was totally incoherent, but we'll see if I can make sense of it. Okay, consider fertilizer use. Okay, it's the sort of easiest case. Fertilizer use in West Africa, so kilograms per hectare. Ghana's going crazy over the last 20 years. Everybody else in West Africa is increasing. So there appears to be some movement. People are starting to use more and more fertilizer. Still tiny, right, compared to the globe. Okay, so it's plausible that fertilizer might be a profitable thing to do. Maybe not, but it's plausible that it's profitable. If you go to northern Nigeria, or Mali, or basically anywhere else I've ever been in West Africa, and you get together a bunch of farmers and ask them, why aren't you using more fertilizer? They give you one answer. That it's I've never had this not happen. The first answer is always, we'd love to, but we don't have the money. It's capital. I just that might be because I'm obviously affiliated with aid agencies and stuff, able to give out money. But I think it's actually true that people think that is because they don't have money. But in Ghana, we can't find much evidence that there's any problem of farmers getting hold of capital, getting hold of money. We gave a bunch of farmers goats. 3 years later, there was no effect of those goats on anything that we can measure that affected those farmers. It doesn't look like there was some constraint on capital that they weren't able to overcome that the goats relieved them from. In another experiment, we looked at the effects of giving farmers cash grants or giving them insurance against rainfall disasters, insurance against drought or floods. And what we found was that when we gave people grants of cash, it didn't change their farming decisions in any way. It's not quite true, but it's essentially true. On the other hand, when we gave them insurance, which was just a promise of a payment if something went wrong with the rain, they invested a bunch more on their farms. So they were able to find money when they saw an opportunity that seemed profitable. So in Ghana, we've got several other studies where we just don't find any strong evidence that farmers are not able to do things like buy fertilizer if they think it's profitable. On the other hand, in Mali, where we've done similar experiments, we find lots of evidence that people have profitable investment opportunities that they're not undertaking because they don't have the money. And so, and even more interesting, those opportunities are only available to some people, not others. There's enormous heterogeneity in farmers' access to opportunities that are profitable, even amongst farmers who look really similar from the outside. So this is one of the villages we were working in, and that's the farms of the woman in that village. They were farming vegetables in the lowland. And so the farms look pretty similar, their houses look pretty similar, people look along a lot of dimensions similar. But we did an experiment which was in 2 phases. We worked with a non-governmental organization, a microlender, to randomize villages into which this microlender went to offer loans for farming. And so in the villages that they went to, they went and they offered loans to folks. After people had borrowed, we then gave grants of cash to the selected sample of people who didn't borrow. And then we went to a control group of villages where the microfinance organization wasn't there at all and gave grants to just a random set of farmers. So we've got a set of farmers we gave grants to who had chosen not to borrow or didn't borrow from the microfinance organization, and another set of the whole population. So from that, we can deduce what what we see in the villages that we gave grants to people who chose not to borrow or weren't offered a chance to borrow. They were offered a chance to borrow, but they didn't borrow. There's no effect of the grant on their agriculture. They don't do anything differently. They don't get any more profits. On the other hand, when we give a grant to a random sample of people, there's an increase in their profits. And by comparing those 2 numbers, we can deduce what the rates of profit would have been had we given grants to the people who borrowed in the loan villages. And those profits were enormous. So about 20% of the people in rural Mali borrowed in our scheme. And that 20% had rates of return capital of over 100%. So enormously different. So a bunch of people had 0 profits. A small minority had very high profits. So there's people who are constrained, their profits change when they get a grant. And they know that they have different returns. They know because they chose to borrow. So, and only those who had high profits borrowed. Okay, so, okay, well, and moreover, if we track these guys for 2 or 7 years later, the people who got the grants are still doing better. So, yes.
Do you know what they use the grants to do?
They mostly use it for farming.
But like how do they make it better?
Fertilizer.
Right.
Fertilizer is the big one. Some weedicide, some hired labor, some tractor use. Yeah. Okay.
Can you predict the heterogeneity with their soil, or is it more of farmer quality, or we
There's, so let me go back. There's some heterogeneity we can predict easily. There's folks, there's a bunch of observable differences between those who borrow and those who don't borrow. But, and we got a pretty rich data set to look at it. But even conditional on all that stuff, there's a bunch that we still can't predict. Yeah. Okay. All right. So there are farmers. There are farmers in Mali who are clearly constrained by capital. When we gave them grants, they transformed their agriculture. It lasted for years. So there's diversity within villages in Mali in the profitability of agricultural investments. There's big regional differences between northern Ghana and Mali in the extent to which there's evidence of capital constraints. And so we see that there's different frictions that are affecting different places and different frictions affecting different farmers in the same place. This is compounded by risk. The amount of risk in West African farming is almost impossible to comprehend. It's so large. This is at least one large component of that risk is really simple. It rains or it doesn't rain. In West Africa, essentially nobody has irrigation. They're entirely dependent upon the rain. And so rain or no rain is a big topic of conversation in villages and a huge determinant of profits. The rate of return to an investment early in the season, like plowing your field, that the rate of return to doing that can vary by a factor of 10 between a bad rainfall season and a good rainfall season. Here's one good example. Here's if it was good rain, this is the distribution of this is our estimate of the rate of return to an investment in early season agriculture. It's not a point because it's a sample, so we're estimating. So there's a standard error around it. And here's an estimate given rainfall that's really bad. And so we know the probabilities that rainfall will be good or bad, and so we can, if we had looked, if we studied this village with this rainfall in this year, we would have concluded that there's about a 50% rate of return to these early season investments. If we'd studied this village in this year, we would have assumed, we would have concluded that the rate of return was highly negative. It was a really bad investment. The point is, when you make these investments, you don't know what the rain is going to be. And so if you look at the historical distribution of rainfall, this is our estimate of the probability of whatever rate of return you're going to get, which is essentially, we have no information. It could be anything. Yes.
I was going to ask was something that you just addressed, which is how well the farmers themselves can predict whether it's going to be a bad rain year, a good rain year. Because if you have people who can predict that well, and then they want to borrow, maybe they have a good idea that it's going to be that good year.
Oh, this is another great question. It's clear that farmers do predict weather. And so we've got evidence showing that they talk to each other about the weather, they transmit information about it, they have some guesses about the weather, both long run and short run. Long run, I can't say much about because it's too hard to study. But short run, we can see how they respond to clues of rainfall or not rainfall by changing days of planting, days of applying fertilizer, days of applying pesticides. And we can look and see if those decisions change when we give them modern weather forecasts targeted towards their village. And they do respond. So that's clearly an active part of farmers' life, is trying to predict the rainfall. Unfortunately, Western meteorologists are very reluctant to make predictions about rainfall in any particular village beyond 2 days. They don't think the models are good enough to get better than looking at the long-term average of rainfall on that day beyond that. So that's another place. I actually would love to look at the history of investments in meteorology, because maybe that's just harder to predict in West Africa, or maybe we just haven't tried.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to ask. Like in the US, you can predict that the snow is going to start at 3 p.m. on a given day with 2 days notice.
The explanation I get from the one company of meteorologists I talked to is that it's just harder in West Africa because of patterns of convection.
Yeah, that's what they say about here.
Okay.
Predicting.
Oh, it's interesting. Okay. So there's enormous risk. I mentioned in this insurance experiment to you before, insurance markets are incomplete. So there's huge risk, there's poor insurance, and this lack of insurance is disastrous. This is from an old paper that looked at consumption in Burkina Faso during the Sahelian droughts of the 1980s. And what was disturbing about this is these were very poor villagers, eating less than FAO recommendations for maintaining your weight when you're doing active labor. And yet consumption is moving directly with harvests in these communities. So people are literally losing weight because they don't have enough to eat. And so these are aggregate shocks. You can look at it individually within the village, and they're also followed. So there's no within village insurance. There's very little across village insurance. So the welfare losses are enormous having to do with those. And so now, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, do we know anything about the history of irrigation and why it's not part of, is it just harder in West Africa? It's there during the Green Revolution, so.
Yeah, that's the big difference, right? Is water control. So you can make these investments. The answer is there's irrigation based on rivers and surface water. And that's what where there's irrigated land, that's what it is. There's no irrigated land from wells that I've been able to locate anywhere. And so I've asked people, some geologists say there's water down there. Others, but I've never gotten an explanation for why I can't dig a well and irrigate my farm from it. Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that. Okay. So we've got 20 minutes.
Half an hour, 20.
Okay, all right.
Sorry,
Yes.
just to complement that, and would it be too expensive to put like irrigation systems, because I know that countries in the Middle East have used it, right? So
Yeah, so there are two different types of irrigation systems that are common in West Africa now. One are large state-run irrigation canals with dams, and so actually one of them in Ghana is being very successful. But it's got relatively limited extent that you can cover because there's just not that much surface water available. And then the more common type of irrigation is informal, locally administered pump agriculture from rivers. And so along near any city, you'll see irrigated fields alongside rivers where people are just informally taking out the water. So those are the two kinds that I've seen. I've just never seen pipe driven. And yeah, it's something that is knowable. Does anybody here know? I've asked many people, but I actually haven't researched the irrigation. Okay, so given the enormous amount of risk that's involved in agriculture, given the lack of insurance markets, finding a way to deal with risk is just essential to life as a farmer. And so let's look at one of the social institutions that have been adopted to help people deal with risk. And that will be the structure of the household in Mali, in one part of southern Mali. So the household structure that I'll be talking about is called a gua. Consider the group of four adult men, say. They've each got a nuclear family. This would correspond to the household that we see in most of our surveys. It would be a husband and a wife, a husband and two wives, and their children would be at the core of a household in most of our surveys. There might be some other people, a cousin here or there, or a niece. But in Mali, these households might be organized into an élargi, a gua in Bambar. And one of these men will be the head of the élargi. And the élargi will be characterized by a joint production on at least one large grain field and joint consumption in which people eat out of a common bowl at least once a day. I had a quote I was going to tell you. Okay. Yeah, about half of in the villages that we're working in Mali, about half of the small households are polygamous. And each of these adults, both men and women, will be involved in agriculture on their own as well. They'll have their own plots. But each of the men especially will be required to work on the head of the Elargi's large plot as well. And that large plot is primarily responsible for doing the core feeding of the parents. It's meant to be the source of continuity for the extended household. About 70% of the population of households are organized this way in this part of rural Mali.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So this is very interesting because you said land is not scarce, so everybody could have a big plot. But the idea here is that the head has a big plot because people work for him.
Exactly. Yes.
So it's a kind of
So
a
it's
power
coordinating.
relation.
It's
Yeah.
definitely a power
Coordinating.
relation.
Yeah.
Yes. And so what we'll see is that the Elargi serves fairly obviously to pool risk amongst these households. In fact, that's obvious enough that I'm not going to show it to you in any detail. Remember, we were giving out money. If you give out money to this guy, she's going to change her farming. And so there's yeah. So they're spreading shocks out amongst themselves. It's being transmitted through consumption of the common food. It's also being driven by transfers within the Elargi. But that's not all the Elargi does on reallocation of resources. I'm going to skip that. It's also responsible for the allocation of labor. It plays a really important role in that. So if you measured labor perfectly, and you measured land perfectly, and there was no risk, and I think it's enough. The efficient allocation of labor would be one line. Right? Everybody would have the same amount of labor per hectare, as long as the production function is conjugated. So that's not what we see. So this is in northern Ghana. So this is with a lot of trying to control for lots of plot characteristics and stuff. There's the distribution of log labor per hectare. It's not a spike at 0. These are the deviations from the predicted amount. If we just look within a village, there's a tighter distribution where there's less evidence of variation in marginal products across plots within a village than there is across the country. And actually, if you look within a farmer, when a farmer has multiple plots, Doug Donlan and I argue that that's a pretty good benchmark for efficient allocation of labor, because it's within a person. We presume that he's allocating labor properly. So the remaining dispersion is presumably measurement error and risk that causes deviations in optimal use of labor across plots. So this gives you the difference between this and this gives you an idea of potential upper bound for misallocation of labor within a village. Okay. And so we can do the same thing in Mali, and it's not as dispersed, it's more uniform than our Ghana sample. But there's the village, and there's the household distributions. We see the same sort of thing happening. But what's interesting in Mali is that if you just look at these gua, the large households, the groupings of households. This is the baseline that's just looking within the village. This is what we get when we look within the household, just within the farm, the one farmer. And that's what we get with the gua. The gua does everything that a household does. So it's able to allocate labor just as efficiently as a single household is able to. And so the gua is being used for both risk and labor management. Okay. So this is great. So what's the problem? We've got an insurance mechanism. We've got a labor allocation mechanism. But there's costs associated with this too, because it's a social institution that's bundling a lot of things. And the first and most obvious thing is the standard moral hazard associated with insurance. This is not data from Mali. This is data from Cote d'Ivoire. It's Corinne's O'Donnell, Grosset, and Cowher's great paper on the social tax. The GUA is imposing a social tax. Do I have it? Yeah, okay, there's an example. There's contention within the GUA on how to allocate resources across your plots. It's strongly related to the moral hazard that I was just talking about. So if we gave a grant to a woman within the GUA, what we find is that she's gonna use a bunch more plow time on her plot. She's gonna substitute plow for her labor. Another female farmer within her same family is also gonna increase her use of plowing. The male farmer doesn't get much out of it. And in fact, the large farm, this large thing, is actually gonna get less plowing time. So there's some conflict between the desires of the woman getting a grant and the man getting a grant. When the man gets a grant, some of it will be used for the woman to plow. Some of it will be used for him to plow. And the large farm, well, it turns out it doesn't use plows much at all anyway. So there's clear tension between what the woman wants, what the man wants, and the allocation of resources in the GUA. And so there's a limit to its size. You can't keep expanding it. There's different preferences, there's moral hazard, and there's different objectives. And so you can get big GUA. This is one. Okay, so yeah, and you also have sometimes somebody breaks off and creates their own household because they're tired of living under the commands of the old guy. Okay, all right. I think I'll almost stop. I want, if there's not many questions, I'll continue and talk about land tenure, and I'll have fun with that. But I can take a few more questions and then conclude at the end of this. How much time do we have left?
15 minutes.
Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Yeah.
I guess I had a question about the GUA and its relation to the kind of rural to urban movement into other workplaces. Do you see that people leave these GUAs to join the city? And in the case of a GUA, is it almost like their local technology is designed around the GUA, and so they actually have bigger efficiency losses from people moving and that reduction of labor intensity?
That's a great question. We followed these guys for 7 years, so we can know this. Yeah, I can see there are lots of ways it's going to interact with this migration, because it may provide a way of pooling capital to finance migration. It might be a way of maintaining land rights while you disappear, and it may be a way of sharing the risks that's associated with it. So yeah, I don't know. Yes.
My question is mostly like if they're all in close by areas, then they're sharing the risk that is mostly related to the weather anyways. So are there other risks that you get?
Yeah. First thing is, it's extraordinary how much variation there is in even rainfall within village. It's shocking, but that's one of the characteristics of the rainy season in West Africa, is you get these micro storms that half the village gets rain, half doesn't. So there's idiosyncratic risk there. There's also idiosyncratic risk generated by the interaction of rainfall and your planting date, your crop, and your plot characteristics. But on top of that, and more important, I think, are pests and diseases, which can be very idiosyncratic. Yes.
I'm kind of curious about, like, related to the riskiness of rainfall, how like people's religious beliefs may be about rainfall as like divine reward, punishment, how that might affect like their effort or like willingness to take up new technologies. And I don't know if that's been.
So, if I heard you right, you're asking about how religious beliefs might interact. Okay, yeah. That's I like that question because it communicates directly with the way people talk about it. And so people pray for rain. People pay for rain to come. And yeah, so that's definitely there. So it must influence their decisions to adopt technologies. It's got to be the case that if you feel more confident about your knowledge about the rain or your anticipation of the rain or your ability to influence it, presumably that affects your decision to take up a different seed. I've never looked at it. It'd be fascinating. Yes.
Are there any differences in terms of demographic differences or economic situations of people who are in these GWAs or your communal farming situations and those that aren't, that could possibly also affect productivity and their use of technology?
Yes, there are. And I'm tempted to ask you what you think they are, because you'll get it right. The GWA guys are older. They're
Maybe more male dominated, which could affect, like the use of the plow, like you just.
maybe, although male domination is pretty ubiquitous in these communities. They're more traditional. They're slightly less educated. They're slightly less likely to be using chemical fertilizers. Yeah, so there are differences, and they're systematic. It's younger generations who have more different ideas breaking off into forming new GWA. And that's historically been true. Yeah, yes.
I have a question. I think you touched on it. How much the literacy rate affect the adoption of technology? Because I think most of illiteracy will be like concentrated in this rural region.
Correct.
Compared to urban region.
Yeah. So actually, I was going to talk about that, and I'm glad you reminded me, because that's one of the issues that the GWA partially solves, partially makes worse. There's a lovely study that talks about the evolution and the life cycle of transfers between households within an extended family, with the older son of one of the small households within the village being supported to go through school by the labor of younger siblings, which tends to broaden the diversity of educational attainment. But educational attainment is so low in these areas that getting one kid through school is an improvement over what happens before. Yeah. But your point about literacy and technology adoption is also totally on point. It's very clear that the primary experimenters with new technology tend to be those who are more educated. Yeah.
Do you know anything about how a GWA is formed? Is it inherited? Is it chosen?
Yeah, there's a great book I can refer to you to, but it's a fairly natural thing. It tends to be an adult male, maybe with a brother, but often with adult children who stay in the household. So it's often the grandfather, a bunch of adult males and their spouses and their children. So it's very patrilineal. Very different from a similar institution in Southern Ghana, which is matrilineal and has different structures. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, is the vast majority of agriculture in this context of subsistence? Because, you know, we might expect that responses were completely different if a large share of this output was being sold.
Yeah, so the answer is that the élargi, the gua, is typically used for subsistence, but the private plots tend to be commercial. And in areas near the city, for example, that's one of the main reasons for breaking up the gua. The adult children want to spend their labor on their own farms for commercial purposes rather than on the gua farm. And so that tension about where your labor is going to be allocated eventually leads many to break off. So that's that we don't see in data because we didn't collect it. It's very clear in the ethnographies. That's what leads to the formation of breakaway households. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry. Sorry. I have a question about the guas.
Yeah.
Because you are giving the example of Côte d'Ivoire, for example. In the country, we have like 60 different ethnic groups. In these ethnic groups, we have tribes different. So you can have like 100 and something structure of guas.
Yes.
So did this account for them? Some are patriarchal, some are really matriarchal.
Yes.
So did this account for the differences?
No, that's exactly what I'm aiming for. Those. It's we can. When there's missing markets for insurance or for labor, you can expect a household to try to deal with that. But depending upon the structure of the household, they'll deal with it in very different ways. And so I don't mean this to be at all a general point, other than in general, we can expect to see different institutions reacting differently to the different market failures that exist around it. And so that's why I'm going to skip this whole fun story about Ghana. That's a really fun part of it. But that's why you can end up with situations where what you would think would be similar situations, northern Ghana and southern Mali, they're not that different. But there's rice cultivation in Mali, all done by women, partly as a result of the way the gua works. And in Ghana, it's overwhelmingly dominated by men. So you get these divergent institutions that cause optimal behavior on the farm to be different. Yeah, so I think so the vast diversity of ethnic groups is part of the heterogeneity that I think is driving the gap between achieved yields and possible yields, and driving the different growing conditions that make it difficult to develop new technologies that can be widely adopted. The new variety of rice that works for them may not work for them, even if everything else is the same, which is somebody back there had something. Yes.
3 questions. Yeah, so the first is about, so you basically problematize the geography hypothesis, and then you're assessing like the impact of population density, and you're explaining that because a lot of people have moved to the urban areas and they're less working in the farm. So my question is, since we're also in the Arthur Lewis building, the Lewisian logic, would that also apply as well, like where you actually facilitate more people going to the urban areas, but then you intensify technology within the rural areas, even if it's a small population density, but it's higher productivity, it's also processed as well, and it kind of creates economic development, I guess, in these countries. So that's my first question. Then my second question was about, so you talk about the importance of capital when it comes to fertilizers, but you also talk about, rain-fed agriculture. So my question is like the prospect of agroecology or regenerative agriculture. So that would be fertilizers, it would be using compost, it would be using manure. And then for water inputs, it would be using like small scale irrigation. So you mentioned like informal, so maybe that'd be like another way of kind of dealing with this bias towards against new technologies, while also there is a move towards these new technologies because they do create higher yields. And my last question, so you talk about the illargi, the gua, and there are really like disparities based on like social dimensions and all that. So my question is, could cooperatives or other associational arrangements and we don't really talk about the state as well. So is there a role of the state institutionalizing these kind of forms, rural organizations to democratize decision-making?
Okay. So starting with the last first, that's, I was going to talk about land tenure, to try to bring up the interaction between the state and local institutions, and how that local institutions which evolved to deal with some of these market failures, in this case, capital markets and labor markets, can be captured by local leaders or national leaders, who can capture the gains from overcoming the wedges that we see in the dispersion of marginal products, and capture them themselves, like the chiefs selling the land that they're supposed to be holding in common for their families, which is a common feature of Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Nigeria. And so I think that the relationship between the state and these local institutions is really complex. Right, that's one. On the other, irrigation, I think, and lack of it in Africa is one of the primary concerns, I think, for me now. It's becoming more clear today that it's really playing a central role, because part of the success of the Green Revolution was the profitability of the new seeds with irrigation. And part of it was the smoothing out. The irrigation makes things more similar, makes it so that a single innovation can spread more widely, because you can control the inputs of one of the key inputs, water. Yeah. You had another one, but I'll get you after.
Oh, okay.
One more? Andrea?
So in a lot of your work, there's a gender dimension to the types of crops that are allocated to different household members. And the story of structural transformation that you started with is also gendered.
Yeah.
Like over these years working in this context, have you seen a change? Have you seen the household gender roles adapting to the fact that the men go and work in the factories? And do these households double down on food, or do they double down on cash?
So there is a fairly systematic pattern of men capturing newly profitable crops. So for example, when market gardens started actually this is in Mali as well, and when market gardens started as Bamako grew, it was for vegetables, which was traditionally a female occupation. So females started it, but as it got more profitable, men broke away from the Gua, got their own land, and are now dominating the commercial garden industry. So that has happened a number of times. Senegal with peanuts, it's a fairly common pattern. In rural areas. Yeah, I'll stop there. Okay, let me take 2 or 3 more minutes, and I'll stop. I'll skip this conclusion. I'm afraid I have many things. I'm afraid that you may be more confused than you were an hour and a half ago. So in Ghana, there was a interaction between the family structure and the land tenure system, such that it was very compatible with the cocoa revolution in Ghana, the beginning of the 20th century. There was flexible land, there was plenty of land, there was a great new crop, it was highly profitable, the whole society transformed itself to take advantage of this profitable opportunity. That and a few other examples make it clear that farmers in Africa, if provided with a technology that can be profitable, will move heaven and earth to make it work. We see that over and over again. And so why do we have these big yield caps? And I think a big part of it has to do with the difficulty of overcoming the set of 10 or so constraints that I put up and said I wouldn't talk about all of them. It's about overcoming the problems of insurance, of access to capital, of infrastructure, and hence dispersion in prices. And my hypothesis is that social entrepreneurs take advantage of features of social institutions to overcome some of those frictions. The problem is that those institutions carry their costs, and therefore new frictions arise. And they all, so land tenure systems, chieftaincy institutions, the organization of households, they all provide this forum in which people can create new ideas for overcoming the constraints that are external to them, like failures of credit markets. And so they overcome some subset of these frictions that lead to the yield gap, but they do it differently, and that enhances the heterogeneity. That's the theme of this whole talk. So you get heterogeneity like this, which is clearly the result of an interaction between these market failures and household organization. Right. That's if I talked about land tenure, we would have talked about how a flexible land tenure system that helps you deal with risk can also lead to chaos like this. Like, don't buy this land; it's not for sale. You'll be buying it from somebody who doesn't own it. And different outcomes like this, like in rural northern Ghana, where large households have broken apart completely into nuclear households, and Burkina Faso, which in a different variety of the extended family, have these huge compounds like Gua, in which people are farming collectively and dealing with the moral hazard and the frictions of different preferences from that. So I'll stop there and hope you got something fun out of this.